Okay, I want to welcome each of you to this video, and I hope this format works out acceptably. I'm sorry we couldn't meet in person today, but we have to take what nature gives us, of course. Um, and I want to say a couple of things by way of introduction. Um, Melanie Klein's theory, to me, is one of the most important psychoanalytic theories. It hasn't been well appreciated in the United States over the decades, but this is a theoretical orientation, derivatives of which really dominate, I think, probably two-thirds of the psychoanalytic world. Europe, certainly South America, um, other countries as well. So it really has been widely disseminated. And that is in spite of the fact that it's considered to be sometimes another one-person model and perhaps a one-and-a-half-person model. But like I said about compromise formation theory, um, this is not a theoretical approach that has to be applied only in a modernistic, dualistic, um, from that kind of perspective, as though one is an impartial observer. And the Kleinians really fully endorse the participant observer model, as do we contemporary conflict theory people. And so they quite appreciate that. But still, they do that without sacrificing the unique things that Klein focused on that have to do with a person's interiority. That is their own interior life, their relationship with themselves, and with how they create their own interpersonal world. So one of the things that I like about it is that it still ascribes a degree of agency to the self that I find appealing and useful in my own life and my own work. You've already had the class with Carol Mason Strachan on Beyond, so you've already been exposed to some of Klein's concepts, for sure, such as projective identification, so I won't belabor those. But I will say that in my view, Klein's theory is really a bridge between classical conflict theory and contemporary relational theory. Because in my view, it places a fairly balanced emphasis on both of these crucial aspects of human experience. That is our relationship with our own desires and our relationship with others. And by the end of the lecture today, I hope that you'll understand what I mean by that. And the way that Klein elaborated how these two aspects are bridged is by using her concept of the internal object representation. Now, to be fair, that's not something that is unique to Klein. The ego psychologists, particularly Edith Jacobson and Eleanor Galenson, and others, and even Freud himself, used the concept of internal objects, and this is something that she got. The idea of an internal object representation is something that Melanie Klein got from Karl Abraham, and then she elaborated it. So, by way of historical background, I want to say several things, and I'm going to be following along with my own PowerPoint presentation so that when I email that to you all as an attachment, if you like, you can follow along with that either on your computer or another device while you listen to this or watch this video. Right now I'm still on the introduction slide, and now I'm going to move to slide 2. Who was Melanie Klein? Well, Melanie Klein is somebody who was trained in Austria and Germany. She herself was not part of Freud's inner circle. Her first analysis was with Sandor Ferenczi, and some speculate that it was a narcissistic wound to her that Freud sent her to him rather than analyzing her himself, though it may have actually been her good fortune, because Ferenczi was probably the most maternal of Freud's inner circle in his style. Klein's husband had worked with for Ferenczi's brother, and that's how she knew him. And she had gotten interested in psychoanalysis right before World War I. She was born in 1882, and so was in her early 30s at that time. And she herself had experienced a postpartum depression. So what affect do you think that clinically she was going to be most interested in? She was going to be most interested in depression. She had a second analysis with Karl Abraham that began about 18 months before his death, tragically from lung cancer in 1925. And he was only in his late 40s at that time. She was reportedly very fond of him and felt the loss deeply. For her, it probably recapitulated what her postpartum depression had been about. And from our view today, we can see that it was essentially a repetition, compulsion for her in her life of a painful theme that was there probably from almost the beginning. But Abraham is the one who had gotten interested in early developmental stages. He had been interested in primary narcissism and in the psychoses, and Klein's theory is one that has been applied significantly, at least at first, to psychotic patients. Abraham treated manic depressives because he found that during their clearer periods, he could do more usual analytic work, and he was interested in the relationship of mania to depression, and especially to mania as a defense against depression. So you can see the influence of these interests in Klein's subsequent focus on depression, which the so-called depressive position we'll talk about, and the so-called manic defense, and on matters pertaining to narcissism. Abraham was also interested in internal objects. Now, let's define what we mean by that. An internal object representation. I'm going to move ahead a little bit. I'm sorry I didn't clue you all in on this. Yeah, an internal object representation, I'm on slide 6 now, is the result of a child's internalization, first of qualities of the mother's presence and care, and then of what Kleinians call the combined parental figure that includes both mother and father. And it's based on Freud's discussion of the relationship of frustration and loss to internalization. If you recall, and Steve probably talked about this a lot, I think I mentioned it too, but in his 1920 paper, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud discussed the example of the approximately 2-year-old grandson whose mother had just left to run an errand, who gleefully played with the ball and string so as to make the ball disappear and reappear. And when he did that, when he moved it away, he would say, "Fort." And when he pulled it back, he would say, "Da." There. And now there is a journal in our field that's called Fort Da. So Freud thought that the basis for the play was the boy's internal representation and feelings about what had just happened, motivated for the desire for control and mastery over the experience of frustration and loss, displaced onto the ball. And this is one of the things that clued me in on the importance of agency and in masochism and in repetition compulsion. By repeating the experience of the loss and then the undoing of it, symbolically, the boy was trying to have a sense of mastery over the experience. But unfortunately, there's other things that go along with that. So it was Abraham who came up with the term part object, referring to a libidinal and aggressive investment in any one aspect of the motor. And he started moving up the timetable of Freud's phases of libido development. And he did it real cleverly by dividing it up into an early Oedipus and a later Oedipus. Early oral, later oral. Early anal, later anal, phallic, Oedipal, etc. And Abraham also focused a lot on aggression and on the importance of ambivalence. That is the conflict between loving and hating feelings toward the parents. Now let's go to slide 7. Actually, go back to slide 5. Klein was very interested early on in investigating Abraham's ideas in work with children. She began child analysis through play by analyzing her own children. Today, this would be unthinkable, but in the early days of child analysis, it was common for analysts to analyze their own and each other's children. For example, Freud analyzed his daughter, Anna. Klein realized that when children would play, they were essentially pantomiming their inner fantasy life around its most important themes, which included their ambivalent feelings towards their parents, siblings, and themselves, and the terribly gratifying aspects of those feelings. Terrifyingly gratifying aspects of those feelings. To observe the child's play was thus to enter into that world, understand it, and to be able to speak back to the child by making interpretations about the play that help the child to integrate, it's one of our favorite words, the conflicting motives of loving versus hating, and the pain that was associated with those feelings. Let's go to slide 7 now. Furthermore, Klein concluded that the play and fantasy life of the small child gave clues as to what the experiences and fantasies of infancy were. And she did this because she thought, well, these are so close in time, you see. The 3-year-old's mental life is much closer to infancy, and therefore it's more reliable than memories or fantasies that adults in analysis might have. So Klein saw the child who walks into the playroom with the various assorted play materials as akin to the infant being born into the world, and the child's making of scenarios with those materials as analogous to the meaning-making, world-creating fantasy process of the mind. Let me say that again. The meaning-making, world-creating fantasy process of the mind. The child would project his or her inner life onto and into the play materials and develop them to fit what was going on inside their emotional world. So she thought, well, this is what infants do. Just as infants drink and expel, the first month of life for a baby significantly revolves around getting breastfeeding established and about burping and spitting up. I had a patient who brought his approximately 3-month-old baby girl into a session for the first time this week, and she sat there very quietly during all but the last 5 minutes of the session, watching her daddy and listening to his voice. But I noticed that she spit up a little bit. He had just fed her before he brought her over, and she was spitting up a little bit, and I asked him, I said, have you burped her? And he said, no, I didn't burp her. Well, but she didn't get upset. Anyway, Klein thought that this spitting up, this feeding and spitting up, feeding and spitting up, was analogous to the way we create the world. We take it in, we put it out. We take it in, we put it out. So we project, and then we introject. We introject, and then project. Speaking of taking in, So, still on slide 7 here, the basic process of mind in the Kleinian model was articulated by Susan Isaacs in her 1948 paper called The Nature and Function of Fantasy. It's a great paper. It's one of the classics of psychoanalytic literature. Isaacs was one of the brightest British Kleinians and one of the best debaters that they had in the so-called controversial discussions of the 1940s. And that was a series of debates between the by then polarized Kleinian school and the Anna-Freudians, who were classical. Simply put, fantasy is the mental expression of the instinctual impulses and the defense mechanisms against those impulses. And it's present from the beginning of life through the association of internal somatic sensations of pleasure and pain that can be loosely grouped as self-impressions with other sensory inputs such as visual, auditory, and tactile sensations that can be loosely grouped as object impressions. However, the important thing to know at this point is that both types of impressions are represented in unconscious fantasy as internal, that is, as within the mind, and they are interchangeable with each other. In other words, the sensation of pleasure or pain can be represented in fantasy as being either of self or of object, and that can shift over time. Here's how the impressions are mingled into the fantasy as a primitive form of story the baby makes up, as it were, in an effort to make sense of its experience. The baby feels a painful set of sensations that we call hunger. But the responsibility for the pain is determined to be outside the self. Oh, I've got that on the slide. Good. In other words, instead of feeling hungry and hallucinating feeding at the mother's breast, which was Freud's definition of primary process and primary narcissism, that is, hallucinatory wish fulfillment. Here, the infant gives a primary or primitive meaning of intent to the hunger. In other words, it imagines mother wants me to feel hungry. I'm hungry because mother wants me to be that way. In other words, pain and frustration are, almost from the very beginning of life, imagined and thus experienced as attacks on the self. Let's go to slide 8. To support this, the Kleinians look in part to some of our colloquial expressions, such as when someone says that hunger is gnawing at their stomach, or they say about someone else, she or he is a real headache, or a pain in the ass, say. Conversely, when pleasurable and satisfying experiences occur, they are imagined to be benevolently bestowed by the internal object mother. So at this stage, the infant doesn't really know that there's inside and outside, according to the basic part of this theory. In the Kleinian model, everything is happening inside the mind of the infant. Now, this is similar to Freud's primary narcissism in that respect. So it's inside the mind of the infant, and it's a matter of primitive interpretations that are focusing on causal inferences, as though the basic question for the human being in life is, why is this happening to me? So the Kleinians also see additional corroboration for this from myths and primitive beliefs and practices in early societies, such as the idea that whether it rained or not was the result of divine intent, requiring measures on man's part, such as sacrifice, to promote the favor of the deity and diminish its malevolent intent. We still think this way today. And of course, the Kleinians believe there's a level of mind for each of us that functions this way. It creates a universal degree of superstitiousness in the mind that never completely goes away, which I think is true. Klein called this way of experiencing things the paranoid position. It's a developmental stage, but it functions more like a mode of experience that one returns to periodically throughout life in the face of internal conflict. That's a very important distinction. It's a mode of experiencing that one returns to periodically in the face of internal and interpersonal conflict as well. Based on her dialogues through published articles with Ronald Fairbairn, who was the only analyst in Scotland, Klein later changed the name of this position to the paranoid schizoid position to reflect and account for Fairbairn's critique of her theory and his clinical data. He worked a lot with schizophrenics, and he saw that they tended to experience themselves as split into parts or bits. So the expression falling to pieces is relevant to this idea. Some of you may have seen Pema Chodron's book, something like How to Come Apart Without Falling to Pieces, or How to Go to Pieces Without Coming Apart, or something like that. It's a Zen writing. But the paranoid schizoid position is characterized by intense fear and paranoia. As an aside, I'm going to mention briefly that American Kleinian, and there haven't been many of them, but one was Thomas Ogden. In his 1989 book, The Primitive Edge of Experience, he disputed Klein's claim that this position represented the fundamental substrate of psychic life, and instead he proposed that the first experiential position was what he called the autistic contiguous position. And this he thought of as consisting of terrors about physical and sensory boundaries that were characterized in infancy by fears that the boundedness of the sensory interface could itself dissolve, resulting in fantasies of falling, leaking, or dropping into an endless, shapeless space. And sure enough, young children do have many kinds of fantasies of being bitten, of drowning, of going down the drain in the bathtub, of burning, of being kidnapped, getting lost. Many of these kinds of fantasies happen. And so there's evidence for this. So where am I? Okay. So essentially, he is assuming that the experience of being a self is based on a sense of boundary between oneself and the world of others, and that the dissolution of this boundary is equated with death and is thus feared by the self. And this may be why the Buddhists refer to the experience of ultimate satori or enlightenment as the great death, or the great enlightenment, in which the boundary between, or identification of one with a sense of bounded self dissolves in favor of the entire cosmos. But I digress. The fundamental imperative of the paranoid position, we're on slide 9 now. The fundamental imperative of the paranoid position, which again the infant is born in, is to maintain a sense of the goodness of the self. And those of you who know about self-psychology will see the foreshadowing here of his emphasis on the cohesiveness of the self. Cohesiveness is a rather vague term that has never been exactly clear to me, although I appreciate Kohut's ideas. But if we think of it as a state that is enabled by a feeling of goodness, then that makes it a little bit more tangible and experientially relatable. So, in other words, the fundamental organizing force at work here If the primary emphasis is on the goodness of the self, the primary motive here is a narcissistic motive, or for the maintenance of self-esteem, the existence of a sense of self, and the goodness of that sense of self. Now, the Kleinians don't say this exactly. This isn't explicit. This is one of those things, to me, that's clear between the lines of theory, as so much of the important stuff in psychoanalytic theorizing is between the lines. So there's our old picture of His or Her Majesty the baby, to exemplify that point. So the fundamental defense from this point of view, then, in Klein's model, is not repression like it is in the Freudian model, although she believes that repression happens, of course. But for her, the focal defense is the defense of projection. Projection is the hallmark of the paranoid schizoid position. The painful sensations that the infant experiences mean bad. Kleinians like to look to common expressions of speech to back up their theory, and so one such expression pertinent to this principle of pain equals bad is the current one of a few years ago, where people would often say, "Oh, my bad," right? This is similar to what I'd said to you in one of my conflict theory lectures about how in the unconscious mind, pain is interpreted and rendered into a sense of blame. Somebody has to be bad, and it ain't going to be me, says the baby to itself. So the responsibility for bad is assigned to the internal representation of the object, whatever that means. But it sounds like a sort of pre-wired compartment in the brain, a sort of file that comes as part of our MS-DOS operating system. The sensory template for this image of the object is the image of the mother's breast. But plausibly, it's also her face. The representation in the mind of the mother thus becomes, or the representation of the mind of her, in the mind of the infant, thus of the mother becomes split into good and bad. And that's what I've got depicted on slide 11 here. And I think continuing on, and the idea here is the experiences of pleasure are attributed to the good breast, and the representation and the bad experiences to the bad breast representation, as though those are two different things. Okay, so at the same time, experiences of satisfaction are interjected from the good object and enhance the sense of the goodness of the self. The infant's inner psychological world is being progressively constructed and elaborated by this continual process of projection, introjection, introjection, and projection, and reintrojection. And this is what I meant when I said the unconscious fantasy is a process of world creation. It's the way in which we create our worlds. Now, the importance of the frustrations involved in the infant's state of dependency are really emphasized in Klein's theory. The state of needing or depending on the mother are understood and experienced as miseries that inspire feelings of hatred and envy. And envy is the affect that they focus on a lot, but only as envy of the breast, rather than Freud's penis envy. So, when Klein read first about Freud's concept of penis envy, and was sort of schooled in that through her work with her first analyst, Ferenczi, who would certainly have talked about that, and her second analyst, Abraham, who would have followed up on that. Of course, what intrigued her was she did one of those figure ground reversals in her mind, like we creatively do. In my first lecture to you about theoretical orientations and their evolution, I talked about how something is centralized and then something at the margin of that or periphery of that core organizational theme of the theory gets brought in, and then what was once centralized then moves to the periphery. Well, that's kind of what Klein did about envy. She said, well, hey, what's really interesting to me is not so much the penis deal here, but what if we look at the phenomena of envy as important itself? That seems to be a pretty big deal in her experience, she thought, and in what she saw in her own children and her own patients. And by the way, just parenthetically, one other little tidbit about their view of transference in those days. One of the things that I remember coming across is an anecdote that after her analytic sessions with Karl Abraham, Melanie Klein would often go out to lunch with Karl and his wife. And that surprised me at first, but then quickly I realized, okay, well, that's the way they conceived of transference. They thought the transference only got activated in the consulting room, and mainly when somebody lay down on the couch. And then once you went out, then the transference was not something that was at least in the foreground, or maybe not even a matter. And that's why Freud could feed the rat man after a session one day, and that's why Karl Abraham could take Melanie out to lunch with his wife, as though in her collegial role, their role as colleagues, mutual colleagues. So, that illustrates how, at least in the beginning, the classical approach was not something that was not human, that involved no human relating on the part of the analyst. But anyway, back to the envy of misery. Dependency itself is misery in Klein's theory. So she's going to focus on envy of the breast rather than the penis. And the painfulness of these feeling states requires some kind of solution within the mind. And it gives additional emphasis and urgency to the wish for omnipotence, that is, for the wish to control this pain and this agony. So for that reason, omnipotence is an illusion that universally develops in the mind. And I'm on slide 13 now and moving forward. So what the infant wants to do is project the bad and introject the good. Freud had talked about projection, and Karl Hahn was interested in it through his work with psychotics, but introjection is a term that Sander Ferenczi came up with, and remember, he was Klein's first analyst. So in this way, the infant creates his or her own psychological world. But eventually the infant realizes that the good and bad objects are really concerned with the one person of the mother, or what they call the combined parental figure. And so this one parental figure in the mind is more complex and has a range of attributes and feelings of its own. So the final point I want to make about projections, or projection, is that the Kleinians understood transference to be a result of projection. Not just onto the analyst, but, as we've talked about before, but of certain feelings and motives, but projection of those feelings and motives into the mind of the analyst or the therapist. And the therapist's job is to then contain those. And what does that mean? That's a vague, abstruse kind of concept. Does that just mean, withstand them or what? What it means to me, practically, is that the therapist's job is to, first of all, accept, and secondly, understand what is being induced in themselves in the process of the treatment. And so the Kleinians call this process of projection into the mind of the therapist projective identification, and I'm sure Carol's already talked to you about that. So, the idea is as this process of introjection and projection gets elaborated, the projections are onto the object representations, and the introjections are onto the self-representations. Okay, just to be clear about where this stuff kind of goes. And remember, it's all going internally. It's not that there's not a world out there, an other out there, a real mother out there that's doing things and is having relationship experiences. But in the building up of this internal world, the projections onto the object representation, introjection onto the self-representation. So let's see, if you go through slide 14, the dependency is misery, the solution of omnipotence. The central wish then in Klein's theory is to be and have the good. So in a satisfaction experience, mother and I are good, but the important thing is that I be good, according to Klein. Go to slide 16, and that is a little crude drawing that I made of the projection-introjection process. There's a slide 17 on projective identification. Slide 18 is kind of interesting because what this illustrates is that part of the bind in psychopathology is that if a person hates an object representation of their mother, for example, and then they experience themselves as being like that representation in any way, then the rule is that from the superego they have to hate themselves too. And that's a problem. Okay, now go to slide 19 and we're on to the depressive position. Now, seemingly in response to this recognition of the fact that the good mother and the bad mother are the same, they're one and the same, the capacity for the emotion of guilt shows up in relation to the fantasy that by doing all of this projecting into and onto the mother representation, the baby is doing something hurtful to her. In other words, when she or he is angry, it's not just as the bad mother who seems separate from the good mother. They are now realized to be the same mother. And so there's the danger of one's aggression destroying the good in the object. Because even though one wants to possess and be the good and have the good and have control over it, if all the internal object representations are destroyed by aggression, then there's a sense of great pain associated with that too. So the solutions of omnipotence and grandiosity aren't complete and total solutions. They come at their own cost. And that is the destruction of goodness in the rest of the internal world. And remember, all of these, actually when you think about it, all of the representations are oneself to one degree or another. Whether that's experienced that way or not, because it's within one's own mind or brain, or mind-brain, they are aspects of oneself. So there's this destruction fear. Likewise, by nursing, the infant imagines that it could be taking something from the mother and creating a hole or a damaged area inside of her, depleting her. Some people have an expression, some therapists actually have the expression, my tits are sore. And mothers do get sore nipples from feeding, and they have to apply lanolin. Sometimes their nipples will crack, and they have to put lanolin on them. So there's actual physical evidence for this idea. So out of both love and guilt, and guilt means a fear of loss, the reparative wish arises in the mind of the infant. So there's a point in those first months of life where you observe a baby putting its own hand inside the mother's mouth while nursing. And later, the older infant will offer its bottle to others. And again, this is in the service of enhancing the feelings of goodness of the self. So now, goodness isn't just a matter of taking in or taking from. Goodness also acquires the self-representation, of giving to and putting into isn't just projection of the bad. There's a giving to the other. It also enables the child to move from what were previously part-object representations to what are called more whole-object relations. So now there's a good self and a bad self. There's a good object and a bad object. The positive and negative being part of the same person. But this achievement is tenuous and fragile, and it often will collapse under the duress of more intense frustration or deprivation, or under the threat of satisfaction sometimes, as in marriage. And if you just parenthetically, if you look at the case of Betty Joseph, the guy who had just gotten married during his analysis, and you know, his dreams that she focuses in on in that section, it's worth rereading, because one of the things that's traumatic to that guy is that he has the experience of sexual satisfaction with this woman in such a way that he can marry her and they can go on their honeymoon. And so even pleasure can be traumatic. That's a very important point. And it is part of what motivates his regression in his dreams that Betty Joseph focuses on. One reason why he wants to destroy the analysis, or he wants to put hopelessness into her, is because he's afraid that the satisfaction that he's getting, it means not only the loss of Betty Joseph, that is, he can't marry his analyst, but it also means that he has to take responsibility for pleasure like a grown man, and he has to accept it for what it is and the limitations of it. You know, no matter how great the orgasm is, it doesn't last forever. And then what do? Okay. So now we're on to slide 20. Here when I'm talking about the precarious achievement of the depressive position, and how the depressive position can collapse back into the paranoid schizoid mode of experience. And of course, when this happens, it increases the person's fantasy of fantastical guilt as well. Now, of course, from a conflict theory perspective, the fantastical guilt itself contains an important aspect of narcissistic aggressive satisfaction. That is to say, a person is saying, my envious and hating feelings are really powerful enough to wound, upset, or depress my mother. And there's a little nugget of narcissistic satisfaction in that. It's like the devil's bargain. It's worth the trade-off at that point to go ahead and go along with the collapse. And it was this feature of Kleinian theory, you see, that really grabbed Donald Winnicott, who thought, well, what are the consequences if the mother really is depressed? How will that affect the baby's fantasy life? And from there, he went on to the importance of the mother and the analyst being able to stay psychologically alive and survive the projection of the baby's and the baby in the patient's feelings. So the main point here is that the depressive position is crucial to developmental maturity. Let's go to slide 20. Because it involves the ability to, number one, tolerate the pain and the frustration of the limits of life. Secondly, it involves being able to tolerate the uncertainties and unavoidability of interdependency with others. Dependency isn't really a choice beyond a certain point. It's a fact of life. We need other people. We need the world. Thirdly, it enables a person to accept both loving and hating, envious and admiring feelings towards others, especially toward the opposite sex. Fourth, to admit mistakes and guilt, to take realistic responsibility. And thus, and most importantly, number 5, to be able to learn from experience and resolve interpersonal conflict. To learn from experience and resolve interpersonal conflict. If you look at the Ronald Britton's case of Peter, I think it was, the boy who was talked about the king of the Wallies. Peter came into analysis, it's implied, because of learning disabilities, whether it was some kind of ADHD or dis something or other. He had some kind of learning difficulty. And you see, in order to learn, we have to be able to accept the wound to narcissism. We have to be able to experience and accept the pain that we don't know it all. Okay. All right. Now go to slide 22. The major defense mechanism related to the depressive position is what is referred to as the manic defense. And here is where Abraham's writing about manic depressives gets echoed. He saw mania as a defense against the pain of depression. It's kind of like a person's self-esteem because of superego persecution would just get so bad, and they're so bad, they feel so bad about themselves and so tormented by that, and then they reach a point where perhaps it's just because they're neurologically able to somehow, they hit a spring kind of, and then spring up into yippee, I'm free. I'm the greatest instead of I'm the worst. I'm the greatest. So let me look at this. Go to slide 23. From the wish for omnipotence, there was a fundamental sense of denial. Denial of the pain that's involved in relying upon the mother. Or in treatment, the pain of relying upon the therapist who sometimes has to cancel, like perhaps many of us did today, or when we go on vacation. So in the manic defense, the person is sort of saying, I don't need you and I don't need anybody. Secondly, it involves the component of devaluation of the needed one. The other is devalued and rendered seemingly unnecessary, as though to say, who needs you? You're too unreliable in this way or the other. I can't count on you. I can't depend on you. But involved with this is a denial also of one's own hating, envious feelings towards the other. The problem is not that one's own feelings are complicated by ambivalence. That's the higher level version of the problem. But in the manic defense, it's just that the other just doesn't love us. It just doesn't understand us or give to us in one way or the other. And you can see how this dynamic plays out if any of you have done couples therapies, those of you that are married or have been in long-term relationships, certainly have bumped into this dynamic because it happens all the time. Thirdly, the wish to master, manipulate, and control, which is the Kleinian version of undoing in the Freudian model. It is by mastering, manipulating, and controlling it. The infant 2-year-old in Freud's Fort Da example was undoing his loss by having that omnipotent control. But he was also mastering the experience. So most, if not all, forms of acting out fall under this heading of the manic defense, including eating disorders and compulsions or addictions of all kinds. Fourthly, I want to mention that the use of idealization is important to it. Initially and superficially, it's the idealization of self, a la, I deserve better than this. And of another, it can involve the idealization of another, a la, I don't need you, but what I need instead is this other person or that other person instead. So this rendering of idealization strategy is a companion to the devaluation. Now please note that all four of these manic defenses have the common function of protecting and enhancing self-esteem or narcissism. Therefore, I think they could be more accurately referred to as narcissistic defense. So all in the first few months of life, according to Klein theory, you have the paranoid schizoid and the depressive positions, as well as the early Oedipus conflict. Klein didn't do away with the later Oedipus. She didn't disregard that. She just posited an early Oedipus and thus preserved a consistency, she thought, with Freud. Okay, sip of water. So now I want to talk about, on slide 24, theoretical problems and their solution. Okay, so if the roots of psychopathology lie in the pre-Oedipal years, how do you stay square with Freud's discoveries about Oedipus and beyond? Here's where things get political, okay? But it's also a matter of love, in the theory making. Klein loved Freud and Abraham, but also remember, Freud didn't analyze her himself. He sent her to someone else. But he shouldn't have, should he? Because she turned out to be a more important contributor than almost anyone else to the body of psychoanalytic theory for 50 years. Anyone else except Anna Freud, Freud's own daughter. And no wonder there was a rivalry between them from that sense. Okay, so how do you stay square with Freud is the problem. Abraham had it, and should Abraham have lived, he would certainly have bumped into this with Freud, and they would have hashed it out. It's a great loss to us, the later generation of analysts, that didn't happen. Maybe Abraham would have parted with Freud too, like some of the others did. But anyway, here's how you stay square with Freud. You don't refute the importance of the Oedipal stage. You simply move it up. And you say that there's an early Oedipus and a later Oedipus. So Melanie Klein moved the early Oedipus up to the second quarter of the first year of life. So that's 3 to 6 months. Now don't ask me how she did it, but I think she did it from her data with the play of 2 and 3-year-old children, as well as from the appearance of the social smile at about 3 months of age. The baby is smiling at both mother and father. Now, one could infer, it's a bit of a stretch, but one could infer that the recognition of both mother and father involves their merging into a combined parental figure, as well as there being separate representations that could involve some kind of triangular arrangement, potentially. That is, the infant could now go back and forth between a combined parental figure and mom and dad as separate. Also, there's another matter. If the superego, according to Freud, is an outcome of the child's negotiation of the Oedipal loving and hating wishes, how do you account for the occurrence of the sense of badness and guilt this early in life. And the experience of what really sounds like attacks on the self during the paranoid schizoid phase. These things aren't supposed to come really till after the Oedipus. Okay, well, the way you can account for that is by moving the timetable of the Oedipus, or as they're called, triangular conflicts, up to very early on. That gets you an early punishing superego that's also based on the Oedipus, but it's an early Oedipus. You can even square it with Sophocles, the original myth that Freud took the idea of an Oedipus from. Remember that when Laius gets the prophecy from the oracle of Apollo that the baby will grow up to kill his father and marry his mother, he essentially attacks the baby by putting a spike through his feet and leaving him on the hillside to die. Can this fantasy of murder be something that is shared between parent and child at this early stage of development, at least at times? It's impossible to prove and difficult for us to entertain, perhaps, but many of our hypotheses are not provable in an objective sense, nor are they appealing to our ego ideals. In other words, we don't like to think of ourselves, our parents, or our children this way. Also, maternal abandonment, something we can entertain, is necessarily implied in this part of the myth, in that Jocasta let Laius do it. So these kind of theoretical controversies matter quite a lot to theoretical purists. To me, it doesn't matter much because I'm more interested in what's more clinically useful. In other words, the most important thing is that the person understand and be able to accept and tolerate their conflicted wishes, however they come, and you and they come in the course of the treatment to conceive of those. What's important is to help someone to be able to experience and accept envious, loving, and hostile feelings towards and with and from all the important persons in their lives, and to entertain those feelings for what they are, which is automatic, natural, unavoidable aspects of human experience, and to tolerate them for what they are not, which is they are not essentially or necessarily relationship destroying, or they don't have to be. They can, in fact, be relationship enhancing. So, regardless of what they theoretically believe about the timetable, the Kleinians, I think, are inherently very practical. They don't appear to resort to so-called genetic interpretations. That is, they don't like to focus the work primarily on what are called genetic reconstructions. And you know that doesn't mean genes, that means historical events in childhood. Instead, they have more of a process focus. They focus on how these kinds of experiences get played out in the here and now, transference and countertransference situation. Okay, we're not far from the end here now. Okay, at this point in the presentation, I want to make it clear that although the aggressive spectrum of affects are emphasized in Kleinian theory, sexual feelings are not unimportant. There's just a couple of points. The first is that in sexual activity, whether it's intercourse or masturbation, the emphasis is not on the goal of drive discharge as it was in Freud's model, but on the satisfaction of what one imagines during those acts one is doing for oneself and to the other. In other words, the specific fantasy the individual has about what the sexual act is about, relationally speaking, what's really going on. The idea is that although something relationally is going on, something else is going on in the fantasy process in the back of the mind for both partners. And in ways those are similar, and in ways they are different. The Klein became interested in psychoanalysis at about 1918, which is when Freud published the Wolfman case. The Wolfman's dynamics seemed to Freud to revolve around his conflicts that were shaped by having slept in his parents' bedroom when they were on holiday vacations, and specifically from witnessing their intercourse. His sense of mystification and the frustration involved in not knowing or understanding what was going on between his parents impressed Freud, and it impressed Klein too, who thought that there she had found corroboration for this universal fact or calamity of childhood as she watched children play. This helped her posit the importance of the epistemological instinct as a component of the libidinal drive. Karl Abraham had earlier suggested it, and Klein elaborated it. Thus, she saw the human being as beginning in infancy a lifelong struggle between the wish to know or understand sexual matters and a fear of understanding and knowing about them. She saw what became known as the primal scene as an inborn fixture of a person's fantasy life that was phylogenetically inherited. That is, this is pre-wired in our minds to have this primitive fantasy of our parents in the act of intercourse. In an infancy, it involves the fantasy that the father's penis resides inside the mother. This is the basis for the equation I may have mentioned once in pre-relational psychoanalysis, that breast equals penis equals feces. Feces, breast, and penis are all interchangeable in unconscious fantasy for one another. Because in this sense, the infant imagines that the breast contains the penis, and this is the combined parental figure. Okay. And of course, the primal scene fantasy can get easily contaminated by aggression because it's going to provoke envy on the part of the infant when it's imagined, and especially if the primal scene is actually witnessed. And many children do have the experience of walking in on their mother and father. I would offer a couple of case examples right now, but since I'm putting this on YouTube and I want to safeguard confidentiality, I can't do that. So let's go to slide 26 about the Kleinian model of treatment. Okay, so from this perspective, emphasis in the treatment is placed upon two major things. One is tracking with and understanding the projective, introjective process between the analyst and the analysand or patient. The analyst tracks the nuances of how and what they experience in being with and listening to the patient. And they take these aspects of their own subjective experience as communications from the patient's unconscious, what Bion would later call beta elements that Carol has talked to you about. They see their job as being like the mother's job, which is to contain, that is to tolerate and understand their meaning and significance. And then, importantly, to be able to eventually say something to the patient or the person that will formulate in a reasonable and useful way, that is, in a way that the patient can hear and make use of what they're feeling and wanting the analyst to feel, what they are feeling themselves and what they're wanting the analyst to feel, and why. It was revolutionary, really, to treat countertransference as something useful rather than merely being a reflection of the analyst's own transference toward the patient. This was a nice idea and one of their great contributions of their school. Okay, so the other major emphasis is placed on alternations that are going on, that they hear in the material and they feel within themselves, between the paranoid schizoid position and the depressive position. That is, in terms that you're familiar with from conflict theory. They're interested in helping someone metabolize their guilt feelings. Okay, so like us, like us, they're interested in essentially demonstrating to the patient that their fears of destructiveness have both realistic and unrealistic aspects. The unrealistic aspects of guilt are shown to the patient by the fact that the analyst can A, tolerate, and B, interpret or talk to the patient about what their wishes are. The mere fact of surviving the attempts by the patient to retreat from or destroy the treatment and the analyst is evidence itself that the fears are fantastical. That the analyst can speak about the patient's dark motives and loving wishes also promotes reality testing by demonstrating that feelings can be important but not have truth value. That is, it promotes a reality testing in the mind, the ability to distinguish between fantasy and appreciate fantasy for what it is and versus actual reality. I think they will also focus on promoting the patient's ability to accept and tolerate the experience of actual dependency on the analyst in the treatment as it replicates the sense of dependency on the mother and father during early childhood, and to tolerate the inability to omnipotently control the analyst without experiencing that lack of control as an insult to self-esteem that requires devaluation of the analyst and punishment of the analyst, or devaluation of and punishment of the self. But some people will do that. They'll say, who needs you? So, you see, these areas of focus really help the Kleinians work with psychotic patients that Freudians might not have tried to work with or analyze, and it helped to stimulate the development of relational theory. One of the earliest relational writers, as you know, or you will know, was Stephen Mitchell. And one of my teachers and colleagues, Charlie Spezzano from San Francisco, recalls going to pick him up at the airport when he was coming in to San Francisco to teach a class for their institute. And he found that he was reading Melanie Klein, which Charlie says was virtually unheard of in the mid-1980s. So Mitchell was certainly on to Klein. One of here's a question. One of my colleagues asked me at a meeting one time, many years ago, came up to me and said, or during the conversation, said, how do you excise a bad object? And I've thought about that question a lot since, and so what I've come up with is that you don't really excise a bad object. What you're doing is, if this process of projection and introjection is continually occurring in life, then this is going on between you and your client or patient. They're projecting their material into the therapeutic relationship, and then they're reintrojecting what happens with it when they do that. And so what's happening is their internal world of self and object representations is becoming gradually modified. And what enables that modification to come to pass really is the degree of acceptance and toleration of whatever the material is, and the diminution of guilt and self-punishment. And you all remember me talking about that famous paper by James Strachey on the nature and function, or on the how change occurs in psychoanalysis, the nature of therapeutic action in psychoanalysis from the 1930s. He was a Kleinian, and so he's talking about how that happens in that paper. So let me be sure that I've gone over everything that I wanted to cover If you want to do further reading about the primal scene, I want to refer you to a paper by Louis Aron, who is one of the prominent relational school writers. Louis is a great thinker, he's a great writer, and he published a paper, I think in '95, on the internalized primal scene. It's a very long paper, but it is very erudite, and he pretty well covers the waterfront in that paper. And I almost included in the readings for this particular class. I don't, only because the paper is quite lengthy. It's a rather long slog, but it is well worth traversing if you have access to the PEP web yourself or someone who does. So, okay, I want to thank you for tuning in, and again, I want to reiterate that I'm available for questions through email that I will post my responses to the whole group if I receive them, and I'm also amenable to scheduling a time to go over the two papers, and especially the case material is what I wanted to focus on during the case portion of the class today in those papers. If we can get, say, 3 people available to do that. So let's see. We'll play it by ear. So, thanks again, and bye for now.